Yeah, we're live.
We're live.
Yay.
We're live.
We're
We're
live.
live.
All right.
Do you have audio?
We do have audio.
You can hear me?
Yes, I can.
I'm like, can you hear me through the mic?
Yes, I can.
Okay, wonderful.
Yay.
We're live. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hello, and welcome to Midweek Mochas at the Owlery. If you haven't noticed from past episodes, we are book folk. Literature runs in our veins. We come by it honestly. Well, literature runs when it's not just coffee.
Mm-hmm.
We do come by our love of books honestly. We came through it through our own education and our own inclinations, and our education was primarily based in the great books. The great books are a worthwhile study, and we will take the time today to explain a bit about where that designation comes from, but we also want to talk about the good books, the 1,000 or so classics of children's literature that prepare a person to enter what has sometimes been called the Great Conversation. We'll also give you some helpful links and resources for compiling your own list of good books for your children. Laura?
All right. So, what are the great books? It's probably a phrase that you have heard before, either a description of a program at a school, typically colleges, but occasionally there might be private high schools that might also mention that they've got a great books curriculum. But what are they? So, in a nutshell, the Great Books of the Western World project began at the University of Chicago, where the president, Robert Hutchins, collaborated with Mortimer Adler, and they were wanting to develop a course that was similar to one that had been originated by John Erskine at Columbia University in 1921. And this was, I believe, in the 50s that they were putting this together. And the purpose was to render the reader an intellectually well-rounded man or woman who was familiar with what was called the great books of the Western canon and become knowledgeable in the great ideas that are visited in the Great Conversation over the course of 3 millennia. The first book that they published is helpfully called The Great Conversation.
And serves as an introduction to the whole project for someone who's not already familiar with it.
Because the idea is that these books that we call the great books, the books that are the flower of Western thought, aren't just happening individually. As one is written and becomes recognized as a great book, later authors study it and have their own responses to it.
They quote it and comment on it. And so you have this series of books over the last 2,500 to 3,000 years that subsequent authors are quoting and commenting on, and it forms a kind of asynchronous conversation.
So what ends up happening is that with this project, it originally was published in 54 volumes by Encyclopedia Britannica. And I
managed to find a whole set for a song at a used bookstore a few years ago. They had no idea what to do with it. It was sitting on the shelf collecting dust. I was like, okay, what do you want for it? You didn't put a price tag on it. They were like, $100. I'm like, done.
Yeah.
Because brand new, these sets go for a lot.
They do.
The good news is all of the books are actually available online through Project Gutenberg and other free resources.
Your library has probably got them.
Nearly all of them are still in print as well.
And if you go to the Wikipedia page, you will find a listing of every text that is contained within them. And because most of these are old, there's going to be Project Gutenberg versions. Your library is going to probably have 90%.
There's lots of print-on-demand reissues.
Yeah.
I know most of them are available free for Kindle if you use an e-reader.
Now, again, if you happen to be book folk and you find one of the beautiful Britannica versions, like we did, where we could just get the whole thing, go for it. Worth it. Anyways,
it does help to read it, though.
Yes.
Like just buying the book set so that it looks pretty on your shelf doesn't really help.
So to go further, 54 volumes, it's a lot of books.
It is. It is a lifetime's worth of reading.
And it covers a huge range of categories. It's not just like literature. You've got fiction.
Or philosophy.
I mean, you've got fiction in the forms of some epic poems and some novels. There's history. There's poetry. There's natural science in there. Mathematics, philosophy, drama, politics, religion, economics. It's this vast range of just everything worth thinking about.
Yes.
And it's an amazing collection of material. And it is in fact part of this whole vast great conversation. And Hutchins wrote that first volume, The Great Conversation, so that you could dig in and understand what was the whole working context. Adler ended up writing this 2-volume work called The Great Ideas, a Syntopicon, and it's this big old index. And so he and a bunch of indexers spent years looking over the whole vast swath of books they'd chosen for the project, and started looking at ideas that
keep coming up
through lines. And so that you can look and you can say, okay, so where has this been studied? How has this been addressed and by whom throughout these books? And you can then go through this index.
So if you have a copy of the Synopticon, you can find a topic, and you will find the citations of where does that topic get mentioned in the other 54 volumes of the compilation.
So if part of what you're trying to do with this great conversation is look at what's the conversation on a particular idea, you can then actually look at the through line as it starts in Homer and ends in the 20th century.
And to be clear, we didn't use this 54 volume set when we were doing great books work in college. We were just assigned the texts.
Yeah.
And then we had seminar style discussions where you read a section of the text, you come in prepared to discuss it. And in the course of that discussion, you naturally start drawing on other texts you've read in a very progressive way. Our son, our oldest, has just completed a 4-year high school level great book sequence. He didn't read all 54 of them either. He read excerpts from most of them, along with some other related texts.
Because there were a few things that they read in full. Some of the novels were meant to be read in full. But I mean, for example, Jane Austen, when they got assigned a Jane Austen novel, that one was read in full. That's something you can reasonably read in a week. And the pace for that class was brutal.
Yeah.
It is not for everyone to try to do it at that pace. And I think that for most people, the benefit of reading slower and deeper over the course of a lifetime has its own benefit.
It does.
But as a survey and an opportunity to have the other idea was the roundtable discussion, that Socratic dialogue of
the discussion is really where the magic happens. And when Adler and Hutchins conceived of and started the Great Book Project, it was to sell the volumes for Britannica.
And it wasn't,
but the idea is
it's not just a collection of books. It was designed around an idea where you'd have a moderator familiar with the text.
They were going to set up little local study groups, and people could read and then meet together on a weekly basis and so forth. That sort of thing was happening all over the place in the 1950s.
Yes. And the idea was in reading these texts and questioning and asking questions, you would interact with the text itself and become part of the great conversation.
So these exist, and they are really works to be read over the course of a lifetime. Some of them revisited, some of them read once. It's like, okay, I've kind of got that. But and in the 1950s, in addition to this being done through Encyclopedia Britannica and trying to set up these study groups for working adults, there were a number of schools that were founded or that shifted their focus to a so-called Great Books program.
St. John's College in Annapolis is really well known for that.
St. John's College in Annapolis is famous for that. Our undergraduate alma mater, the University of Dallas, was founded by a number of people, including Donald and Louise Cowan, who were involved in the movement, and was started as very deliberately a Great Books focused program. I know later in the 60s, University of Kansas started the Pearson Integrated Humanities Program, and then invited John Senior and Frank Nellick and Dennis Quinn to manage that program. And what Senior, Nellick, and Quinn observed was that a lot of their undergraduate students weren't yet really ready for the great books per se.
Which leads us into the next segment here, which was that the great books are what we talk about, but there's a different set of books that might be worth reading first.
And so to start, let's take one of them, like the Iliad. The Iliad is a fantastic epic poem. It's fairly long. It's basically 24 chapters the way it's printed in a modern bound volume. depending on the translation, it can either be eminently readable or absolutely incomprehensible, because it's coming from a very archaic form of ancient Greek. And so you obviously have to have a translation in between, unless you are familiar with this archaic form of ancient Greek. And the poem itself is about 3,000 years old, give or take a couple of hundred. It's beautiful, it's moving, it's got some very profound meditations on a whole host of subjects. I first read it in translation when I was 12 or 13, and I have come back and revisited it several times. But I would not recommend just grabbing a copy of the Iliad off of Amazon or out of the library and throwing it at your 12-year-old over a summer reading period. That's or worse, kind of assigning as this year we're going to read the Iliad because it's a great book. What Senior noticed, and I have certainly observed this in homeschooling our own children and helping advise other homeschoolers over the last 15 to 20 years, is that there's some preparatory work that can be done. I kind of lucked into that preparatory work. I had read a lot of what John Senior came to call the 1,000 good books, and it was by no means an exhaustive or definitive list. It was simply his list of opinions. And again, I didn't encounter the good books list until I was out of college.
Yeah,
we were looking at homeschooling, and
we were both fortunate in that we benefited from the Great Books program we had, because we had sort of stumbled through the
a lot of the good books as well. So the good books are, it was a list John Senior compiled in his book, The Death of Christian Culture, that outlined basically 1,000 books that he thought every young person should read in preparation for reading the great books. And again, he's very clear it's not an exhaustive list. There are a number of excellent books that are not on the list. You will not find C.S. Lewis's works on there. You won't find J.R.R. Tolkien's works on there.
And for good reason at the time that he was writing.
Well, at the time he was writing, but they were both. Well, Jack Lewis was C.S. Lewis was dead.
Yeah.
But Tolkien was still alive.
But they were still too contemporary,
and they were still very, very recently published.
Because there was an understanding, and this is actually one of the things I think that, not unlike the fact that we draw our saints from those who've already died because we have the entirety of their life to look at. In the same way, when you're looking for good books, you should look at books that have started to stand the test of time.
And Senior was born in 1923. He has a very, very colorful life history. And you know, kind of a thumbnail sketch of his life is worth going into on its own. But what he and Dr. Quinn and Dr. Nellick decided to do is that, in addition to reading through the great books, which were the official curriculum of the Pearson Integrated Humanities Program, they would start teaching folk songs, and they would start memorizing poetry with the students. And they would also go into some of these good books in order to help unlock what was going on in the great books and facilitate the conversation.
Because there was that recognition that, you know, the students were coming in and they didn't have the context.
They didn't have the foundation.
Yeah.
And so if you are tackling home education now, and you have younger children, if they're just reading, if they're learning to read, even if they're not reading yet, you can read aloud. We continue to read aloud to our children, even our ones who are now very, very strong readers. We draw a lot of what we choose to read from the good books list that John Senior compiled. There's another online list that had been put together by some folks that, just because of the ease of accessing it online, I've been referring to for probably 15 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, when the kids are kind of wandering around, well, I'm bored, I don't want to read what we've got on the shelf, what else is there? Have you considered this? Have you considered that? And then we can kind of pull those out and suggest they read them.
Mm-hmm.
John Senior's list has obviously lots of poetry. There are lots of Westerns in there, because he thought that was critical to understanding the American experience. There are mysteries. including some that, if you read a lot of 1930s era golden age of mystery fiction, you'll have kind of some of those authors making snide remarks about other authors, and there's a lot of textual it's now called among academics textual interplay, where you have people commenting on each other's work.
Well, especially if you're reading someone like Dorothy Sayers.
Yeah, and again, Sayers is another one of those brilliant minds who gets bandied about in homeschool circles, and part of why is because she comes out of this. She had a great books education before it was labeled a great books education.
Yes.
And to some degree, why it's called great books is because it's modeled on what I believe Oxford called their Greats series, which was one of the specializations you could take when looking for a degree in the late 19th, early 20th century.
So how do you find this list? Because if you're going, yeah, I'd love my kids to be able to study that, or I want to give them the foundation that they are able to study that if they decide to go to a college that does that sort of thing. I'm not sure I can prepare them. I'm not sure I can teach them myself, but I'd like them to be able to, participate in an online class or go to a school that does this. What are these good books? And the great news is that there are several ways that you can find excellent lists that are going to allow you to tackle that. Well,
let's back up just a second. So we've got resources that'll help cover the good books into the great books.
Yes.
And that's really appropriate to your younger kids, your early elementary, your middle school, even your high schoolers, if they haven't had this kind of preparation.
Yeah.
And that's a separate question from how do I get my child this education, this encounter with the great books?
No, I'm talking about good books.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was unclear.
Okay. I'm making it clear.
Okay.
All right. So first, you could get yourself a copy of John Senior's The Death of Christian Culture. The whole book is worth reading. But for the purposes that we have, there is an appendix, The 1,000 Good Books. And it has, conveniently, a list starting with the nursery ages 2 to 7. So we're talking books like Aesop's Fables, Hans Christian Andersen. I mean, fairy tales are hugely important.
And especially at that younger age, the illustrations are key.
Yeah.
He recommends particular editions.
Yeah.
We can certainly make specific recommendations.
Yeah, if you can find those 19th century copies that have the beautiful watercolor illustrations.
Well, you want modern reissues because little kids are really brutal on books.
Yeah, our library has got this 1 or 2 shelves of things that we've managed to find at half price of beautiful salvage of vintage books, and they're like, we keep these in the hopes that one day we can actually do that. But we've got that's version 1, and then we've got the version we actually read to the kids.
Yeah.
But we love the illustrations from some of those older ones.
I know. I pull out our original edition, Winnie the Pooh, when I read that one and Wind of the Willows.
Wind of the Willows.
Wind of the Willows.
And the reason you thought that is that they had
Ernest Shepard did the original Winnie the Pooh illustrations and also Wind of the Willows illustrations. So.
And they're great. Although, while I have problems with the abridging that they did with it, the Inga Moore illustrations.
Because Inga Moore is a gorgeous illustrator.
Oh, fantastic. Anyways, illustrated volumes, and yes, these are nursery tale level books, but they're
so they work as read alouds. Once children are reading, they can read them to themselves, but they're revisiting them. And we're about to start revisiting some of those.
And they're part of the foundation. And now that I think about it, it was because I loved Greek mythology so much and found good books.
I devoured Greek mythology.
Yeah, because I found good books of Greek myths, I think that was one of those preparations for reading something like the Iliad that I had. Because you can't read the Iliad if you are unfamiliar with that world and how much of it was built around their understanding of the interplay of the gods with their lives.
You can read the text, but it is a lot more confusing.
It's much more foreign country.
It is. So Death of Christian Culture, in the appendix, John Senior has his list.
And he does note that it is an incomplete list.
It is an incomplete list. And there are certainly books that I would add to it. There are whole authors that, having read 1 or 2 of them, even with the kids, nobody really enjoyed them. So we just kind of struck those off the list of like, okay, we've read a book or two by these people. We're not really going to revisit it.
Yeah.
You said you had a couple other resources.
So I have put in the show notes a link. I found it's like if you Google 1,000 good books, you will find numerous homeschooling resources. I put one that I thought was very good because, like John Senior's, it was organized by the sort of different
age cohort,
age brackets. And part of what I liked about that one, it was assembled by a group of moms. And so there was that recognition of, it's been 50 years on since the Integrated Humanities Program.
Yes.
And so by that point, Narnia has stood the test of time. So it's made it on the list. Same with Tolkien's work, that there are authors who are slightly more contemporary, but have had enough time for people to say, this fits.
Yeah.
This is part of this story. These are books that are going to help build that imagination, that sense of story, that sense of that aesthetic sense that's going to do that. And so I found a good one that I have gone ahead and put in the show notes.
Right. Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
The third one, and this is more of a suitable for homeschooling of how the heck do I organize this? IEW, Institute for Excellence in Writing, produces a book called Timeline of Classics. No, not sponsored, although goodness knows I'd love them to. Timeline of Classics takes a lot of these good books, as well as some of the great books like the Iliad and the Odyssey, but it takes the good books and it organizes them by things like
chronological sequence and of the subject matter, not necessarily when the text was written, but also organizing them thematically.
And so it helps you to have a couple of different organizational schema beyond grade level that you can look at. So if you're saying, well, we've decided we're going to study the ancient world this year in history, or we're doing ancient Greece or ancient Rome, or both together, that and Egypt. And you start looking for, are there books that we can integrate in that are suitable to my child's general reading level, or for suitable as a read aloud to them, that are going to fit with that theme.
Right.
And that way you make this, it helps you to have a way to organize your reading. And so that's how you start doing the living books and the good books and finding one that sort of hits both of those.
Yes.
And a perfect example of would be, I think we're starting to roll into another cycle of studying the ancient world with the kids.
Yes.
As far as our history study, and part of how we do that is living books. And there's a fantastic series of books by Henty.
G.A. Henty, which
he wrote the sort of stories that used to be called ripping stories for boys. Adventure tales, usually a male protagonist, but they were fascinating, historically based novels.
Mm-hmm.
Each of them very well researched, so that in it you had both a really good.
I can't remember if G.A. Henty was a man or a woman.
I don't recall. I think man.
Okay.
Regardless, wrote fantastic adventure tales that also in the course of it gave you a ton of history.
They are, for the period in which they were written and published, which is the late Victorian period, they did represent accurately the general historical and archaeological scientific consensus. Some of that's changed in the last 120 years, but they're still very well written. They're substantially solid. I mean, it's not like, we all of a sudden decided the Egyptians had, power tools or something like that. And so there's a whole series.
And so I was like, a perfect example would be, grabbing the Cat of Bubastes.
Right.
Which it takes place in ancient Egypt.
Ancient Egypt.
I believe during the New Kingdom, during Ramses.
I think so.
Ramses II's rule. But
although his datings are off.
That is controversial.
Don't go down the rabbit hole.
I will not go down.
Don't go in there. Don't go in there.
I'm
sorry I brought it up. I'll shut up now.
Suffice it to say, there is historical dating is always slightly controversial.
It is. It is. But as far as the Cat of Bubastes, there's a ton. I think Henty wrote 120 or 150 of these books, and so Cat of Bubastes deals very explicitly with a young man captured in battle, brought back as a slave to Egypt, and through his eyes as a foreigner, he is describing his experiences with the Egyptians. And so it offers a point of entry for a child who is a stranger in a strange land in terms of learning about ancient Egypt in a very memorable, visceral way. These are the kinds of living books that someone like Charlotte Mason is talking about when she says these are kind of the important books for children to read.
And then, and in a similar vein, sticking with the ancient world, there's a fantastic retelling of the Iliad and the Odyssey by Padraig Colum that
we read that in middle school.
Yeah.
And it was having read that led me to actually pick up the Iliad in translation. I think it was the Lattimore, if I remember the cover image in my memory correctly.
Yeah. And so having that, you can say, you can use that timeline to say, okay, I'd like to study this. And most of the books in the timeline of classics are those good books.
Yes.
They're going to be preparatory. And if you mix that with some spending time with, especially with your younger children, with those nursery stories,
fairy tales. We have a whole collection of English nursery rhymes rendered into excellent Latin that are part of the memorization work we do with the kids.
And poetry memorization is an excellent part of that as well. And you can start with just memorizing Mother Goose. That is formative.
Yes.
And it's formative for a number of reasons. I mean, poetry memorization, the value of it cannot be
that's a show unto itself.
It is a show unto itself.
It's several shows. It's a whole series.
I might actually see if I can get Andrew Pudawa on to talk about that.
We should, yes.
Because it is very important. But there's a reason why John Sr. thought that it was important for his college students, because when he realized,
and having known some of those college students, that's the other thing, is like, obviously we're not old enough to have attended the Pearson Integrated Humanities program in the early 70s.
We're kind of like grandchildren of it in a sense.
Yeah, we have both teachers of ours and friends of ours who did go through that program, and who our interactions with them when we were in college had a profound effect on the course of our lives.
Mostly because the program, it's the funniest thing. It only lasted for 10 years. And partly it was because there was a lot of concern that you had a bunch of hippies, deadheads who'd been following the band, who roll into Kansas, go to this program, and the next thing you know, they're founding monasteries. And there was this concern. It's like, are they
they doing? What are they doing? And the program did get shut down.
Although the investigation confirmed that no, there wasn't anything,
weird
going on.
Any weirder than reading lots of books and doing lots of poetry and singing lots of songs,
stargazing and such. But it did, and we happen to know various people who did, go on to found monasteries, or go off and do other things, and have founded other colleges as well,
and high school programs.
Yes.
So I mean, we can throw up a link to the high school program that our oldest just completed.
Yes.
It's aimed at high schoolers. The pace is very, very quick, so this is not something to put a slow reader into. But if you have a child who's inclined this way, and you're kind of at your wit's end of how would I offer this to my child? Like our oldest, part of why we put him into this program was with the idea that if he decided not to go to college, he would at least have had some exposure to this in a more structured way than we can provide while, juggling the other 5 kids.
It's like, can I read Mother Goose to my kids? Yes. Can I even, do read alouds of a whole host of other things? Yes. But once I get to, can I do a deep dive into Iliad and the Odyssey while I'm still trying to deal with toddlers?
No, if only because we don't have time to reread those right now on top of everything else. We'd be drawing on recollections of conversations we had 20 years ago, and 25 years ago.
It's been taxing just to be able to coach him through essays where it's like, okay, I remember this one well enough to ask you good questions to help you form your thesis.
Or I have no clue. You're on your own.
I'm so sorry. I did not read War and Peace.
So that's also an option, especially if you're approaching that high school. They do have a credit track through this program. And
I think they actually I think some of the discussions that they do for their younger grades actually are based around some of the good books. that they've actually got some of that preparation idea built in.
That's if you're kind of just struggling with where to start with the whole sequence.
Yeah.
And again, if you want to reach out,
the more structure, and that's the thing. If you're looking for structure, if part of your struggle is you're not ready to roll your own, then there are programs that have been inspired by the entire idea that might be able to help guide you through and get your footing.
And we can certainly help. If you want to contact us, we can talk through what some of those options might be.
But the simplest starting point would really be looking at one of the online lists and just building a reading list based around what's going to be appropriate for your child's age.
Pick 3 to 5 books that the titles interest you, or you're like, oh, I've always wanted to read that, and just start there. If you've got a strong reader, what I would encourage is develop a habit of reading aloud as a family or as a family unit. Whatever they're reading, find something that's just slightly beyond that level, and that's what you should be reading aloud. So like our oldest gets bored when we read some of the early stuff, when we're rereading that, but it's new to our youngest children.
Mm-hmm.
But there are books we will read aloud that are definitely on their level, and the younger ones get a little bored and squirmy.
Mm-hmm.
Finding the sweet spot can be difficult, especially if you've got the age range spread we do, which is 8 to 19 at this point. But for the most part, even if they're not, and read alouds and all, that's kind of its own thing. But as far as good books to great books, there are literally more books that can be read in a lifetime than there are years to read them. But one of the joys of encouraging young readers is they're still developing their taste for what do they like, what do they not like, how do they encounter a book. Learning to ask just some basic questions that go beyond, well, did you like it?
Actually, to that end, I may go ahead and put in a link to what is it? It's a guide to learning Socratic discussion and
engaging yes. Of course, the name escapes me.
The name is escaping me. I will find it and I will put it in the show notes, because that was actually a very helpful course. It's a really great way to take the.
It's one thing to go through that kind of education like we did. It's another to say, okay, how do you now work as a moderator and facilitator of this kind of.
That first step is just reading those books.
Yes.
And you really can just begin with putting together a reading list and making it a stack of books to say, you finished X. Here's one that I think you might like. Mm-hmm. And keep it casual.
or have a close family friend make a recommendation, since frequently the recommendations of the old man get ignored by the lads.
If you have to get a little sneaky, that's fine. But however you do it, whether it's here's a reading list of books to look for at the library, or here's a stack of, you finished that book, why don't you try this one next? However you do it, the next step beyond that is to start looking at, okay, how do you ask some questions that are going to get them,
so that you can have discussions about these things.
And there's a fantastic course that actually digs into how do you have a conversation. And you can start with a conversation about a poem, something like, we're just past 4th of July, Midnight Ride of Paul Revere.
Okay.
There is a way to engage a poem like that, and read some poetry together, and just there's questions you can ask that get into everything from the sound of the poem, of does the rhythm of the poem make you think of something? And there is something about that poem's rhythm that makes you think of horse beats, of horse hooves beating and running along a road, and that's something that's important to the poem. But you can dig into the history of the moment and what's going on, and you can similarly with a poem like Horatius at the Bridge.
Yes.
You can ask questions about the character of Horatius and what you think of him and what choice was he faced with.
Right.
And just learning to ask and engage the text, to start having conversations with it, as opposed to just passively reading it.
Right.
Is that's the big step that you're going for. You want your kids to start taking texts as things they can have conversations with and encounter in a more active manner.
And the texts and the conversations the reader has with the text should also facilitate conversations first in the home, and then branching out into the wider world, and that kind of graduated expansion of the conversational community is participation in again, what a lot of the folks involved with setting up the middle to late 20th century great books programs we're talking about with the Great Conversation. It's a conversation that goes back 3,000 years. You are stepping into that stream,
and it's forming that preparation that reading Aesop is what's going to allow you to read Socrates.
Yes.
And it's that learning to engage the text,
and all the way up to being able to read, Milton Freeman or John Maynard Keynes or Salman Rushdie. Like, I remember trying to read Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses as a teenager because it was in the news, and it was an interesting book to read, but it was also clear in reading it that there were huge gaps in my ability to understand the text because I didn't have context and for what he was writing.
And there is that experience that you have if you read a book and you realize it's kind of like walking into a conversation near the end.
And there's that awkward moment where the two people conversing kind of look at you and you're like, I'm not really sure if I should be here.
Yeah. And so
the good books help eliminate that when encountering the great books. Both are helpful in pulling children out of themselves and out of the present obsessions, whatever's in the news, whatever's causing you concern, and recognizing there's this whole stream of human thought and existence and realization that we participate in. And it's really just a few steps from where you currently are to being able to step into that stream. And I know certainly when I get overwhelmed by news, events, etc., one of the things I will do is just take a step back and I'll dive back into that stream. And then when I feel refreshed, I'll kind of go back out and engage things again. So I think that wraps us up for this week.
Yep.
If you aspire to studying the great books, take heart. Prepare the soil with the good books. Build your list, head to Amazon or your local library, or even Project Gutenberg, which again, if you're big on e-readers or you want to print stuff out and mark it up, there are plenty of options to fit any budget. This could be the summer reading list that changes everything for your family. If you have any questions, you can leave a message in the comments, contact us by email or through social media. Links to all of that are in the show notes.
Yep.
And if you found this helpful, please share it with your friends. Please share it with your enemies. Please share it with your frenemies. Until next week, ciao, ciao.